the Bells. When the winter months set in, and the cold seeps into your bones, when the weight of buying 1,000 presents drains your bank account and eats at your joy, listen for the bells.
Now, Dasher, now, Dancer, now, Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donner and Blitzen. Rudolph, guide my sleigh true in this hour.
Santa tightened his grip on the reins. The wind was whipping his beard back into his face. He had to brush it to the side in order to see. He dared not slow down. At any moment he would be crossing the border into North Korea. He took in a deep breath of the windy yet calming air. It would not be long before they spotted him, and his peace would be broken. The North Korean army had declared to stop Christmas this year. Their children had been sent to bed, thinking Santa would be turned away. He would not. Passing through a cloud, he could see the lights of a city spread out below. Santa looked down at the radar on his dash. A red warning light was flashing on the screen. It indicated to the right of the sleigh.
"Hard left," he called.
Rudolph banked left, taking the other reindeer and sleigh with him. Santa braced as the G-forces threatened to throw him out of his seat. There was a tremendous explosion where they had just been. It lit up the sky like lightning.
"They were ready for us this year," he called to the reindeer.
The radar flashed and Rudolph banked. 2 more explosions went off, one throwing the sleigh momentarily sideways. Santa was knocked onto the floor. Sitting back up, he pulled his hat out of his face.
"Incoming missile,"
a speaker on the dash announced. Santa looked at the radar. A red dot indicated that it was coming from behind. He dove head first into his sack, coming out with a present.
"How many skateboards does little Tommy need, anyway?"
he said, lifting the skateboard into the air. He waited until the missile was in sight and let go. The skateboard sailed out into open space, flipping twice before colliding with the nose of the missile. The explosion that followed sent both sleigh and reindeer hurtling forward. It took everything Rudolph had to bring them back under control.
"Ho, ho, ho! There is no technology that will ever beat the magic of a well-placed present,"
Santa cheered. Rudolph spotted their first house and began to dive. There were a few more explosions. None could catch the sleigh. Santa cringed as the ground came rushing up. Lines became rivers, dots became houses. He could no longer see the horizon, and the whipping wind was all he could hear. Rudolph pulled up at the last second. Sparks flew as the sleigh nicked the ground.
"Whoa, ho, ho!"
Santa said as they rose up. He could no longer feel his face. It was so frozen. He wiggled his nose and cupped his mittens over his face. His hands were still up when he spotted their first stop, an orphanage. There were 3 men standing guard on the roof. Each one had a machine gun. Rudolph came down right on top of them, knocking all 3 off the roof as he landed.
"You have 1 minute, Santa,"
Rudolph said, unclipping himself from the sleigh and jumping down to sweep the perimeter. The other reindeer all unclipped themselves and spread out to take a watch from every vantage point. Santa slung the sack over his shoulder and made his way to the nearest chimney.
"Contact,"
he heard Donna say, and watched as the reindeer pounced over the edge. Looking back at the chimney, Santa reached into his sack and pulled out a handful of magic dust. It sparkled through the air as he let it slip into the chimney. As had happened so many times before, a bright ball of light appeared in the chimney's mouth. Santa's eyes glistened with the reflection of it. He reached out and grabbed it, first feeling the magic through his glove, and then his entire body. The ball of light sucked him in and shot down the chimney. He was pure energy, swirling around the inside of the ball. There was no sense of direction. He simply was. The ball cracked at the bottom of the chimney, and Santa morphed into a solid form. He was once again a fat man in a red suit. Looking around, he could see that there was no tree, so he pulled off the sack and began digging around for one. It took a little longer than he would have hoped, but he soon found one and began yanking it out. That was when he heard Rudolph. "Run, Santa!" Santa turned in time to see a net being thrown over Rudolph outside a near window. He turned to run for the chimney but stopped. There was a man standing there. He must have snuck around while he was digging around in the sack for the Christmas tree. Santa began to run in the other direction. He didn't make it 3 steps before a second man tackled him. He tried to fight his way back to his feet, but could already hear more men rushing in. He could see feet running all around as he was thrown back to the ground. He had stepped right into a trap. They bound his hands and legs and tied a blindfold around his head. He tried to break free to no avail. There were simply too many men. They lifted him up and carried him outside.
"I'm Santa Claus. You can't do this,"
he said. He felt them toss him into a car and begin driving. He listened to their voices to try and decipher who his captors were. He made out 4 men and sensed that all of them were on the naughty list. They spoke Korean, and like all languages, Santa understood it as if it were his native tongue. They didn't go very far before stopping the car. Santa waited patiently as they picked him up and carried him into a building. He went along as they set him down on a hard surface and left him alone for several minutes. He flinched and squinted as they ripped the blindfold from his face. He was inside a jail cell. 7 or 8 Korean soldiers were mocking him. The reindeer were nowhere to be seen. Through his bond with them, Santa could sense they were close by and in distress, probably right outside.
"You should not have come to my country, Santa Claus," one of the men said. "You were never a good child," Santa said in flawless Korean. The man swatted a nightstick against the cell. Santa reached into his pocket. The soldiers drew their guns. Santa pulled out a small box that began to play jingle bells. The soldiers started to laugh. One came into the cell and snatched the box from Santa's hand. Santa sat there patiently, his bound hands in his lap. They laughed and tossed the small box back and forth. They mocked him and his reindeer. They made it a point to be vicious with their insults, bragging about stopping the children from getting presents. Santa counted backwards from 10 and then coughed. His captors grew silent, waiting to see what their helpless captive would say. "You laugh, you joke, and make fun of my bells, but what you don't know, they're calling my elves."
The lights went out as Santa said the last word.
"Get those lights back on,"
one of the men demanded. There was the sound of people rustling around and bumping into one another for a few seconds before it was drowned out by a man screaming. The lights flashed back on. Over the short span of time they had been off, the room had erupted into a scene of chaos. Each soldier now had 4 or 5 elves clinging to him. The elves looked like normal people, except for the fact they had pointy ears and were the size of puppy dogs. Their clothing was Christmas green, with red stripes all over, and their shoes curled at the end. The soldiers fought to get the elves off, but they would not budge. Instead, the lower elves tied their shoes together, while the higher elves covered their eyes. The elves in the middle tickled them. As the soldiers thrashed around in fits of laughter, their laces would catch and they would come crashing to the ground.